Anglo-Saxon history is filled with tales of blood-soaked warlords and shield-shattering heroes atop mighty steeds. It's a bloody, brutal, fascinating period of our history that's usually associated with the manly art of drinking flagons of mead and the even manlier art of stoving someone else's head in. But of course, there were women in this world too, women who were often much more influential than the men like to think or we like to remember. I'm Conor Gormley, and this week on Winchester Today Arts Plus, I'm joined by David Stokes, a novelist whose latest work tells the story of one such woman, Æthelflæd, the daughter of that legendary English king Alfred the Great, who rose to power in Mercia as a kind of warrior queen after his death. David, before we start talking about your work, tell me a bit about how you got into writing.
Well, I've been interested in history for a long, long time because I studied it at university. But when I left university with a history degree, I found you couldn't make much money at history. So I got a job in business, and business sucks you in, so that I didn't really have much chance to follow my passion, which was history and writing about history. However, I got a chance when I started my own business because I was told that in your own business, it's very hard to make a living. So I started going to find some part-time work and discovered I could teach at Kingston University, teaching business, not history. And when you work at the university, you have to write. So that's when I really got into writing. So I was into my early 40s, I guess, when I started writing as part of my career. And of course, I wrote about business. So my first textbook was about small business and entrepreneurship, which became quite a good selling textbook and led me to write lots of other books and articles about business. When I got to the elderly stage of being called an emeritus professor, I found I had a bit more spare time. And so I started writing fiction because that's what I guess I always wanted to try my hand at fiction.
How did you find that transition from the world of business, which I imagine is very, very hard-nosed, but I could be wrong, obviously, into the world of publishing and writing fiction?
Well, I actually found that the world of business and writing and publishing is a fascinating one because when I started writing, publishing was beginning to undergo an enormous transition with the advent of digitalization, with online bookstores and Amazon and all those things that really have transformed the world of writing. So writers have had to adapt to a whole new world. In my early days, I had to get an agent, I had to get a proper publisher. Now the spectrum of publishing options as an industry is very, very wide. You can totally self-publish and just be your own publisher and hope to make yourself known amongst the millions of other people that are publishing their books online. Or you can go right at the other end of the spectrum, which is traditional publishing, which is still available. However, that's an incredibly difficult path, which involves you finding an agent, and that agent then has to find you a publisher. So it can take a long time, and it's really for the very select few who can get themselves down that path. There are many options in between, however, and I think the great thing for modern day writers is that you can choose an option to suit you in a way. So I'm going with a publisher that does partnership publishing, where they will do a proper publisher's job. They will get your book into the bookstores by having them available on all the wholesaling sites that the retailers use. And they will do lots of press releases and get you out there. But you have to commit some investment to your book. They don't pay an upfront royalty. In fact, you pay them a little bit of money to get your book published. And that helps them to invest more on the marketing side, which is really the key factor in all of this.
So tell me about the latest book. You know, it's called King Alfred's Daughter. It comes out on the 28th of March. Obviously, it's about King Alfred's daughter, but what's it about beyond that? Give me a bit more detail.
Well, I've always been interested in Anglo-Saxon history, and it really started because when I was at school, no one mentioned the Anglo-Saxons as a historical subject. And it
Hmm.
wasn't until I got to university I discovered that there was this whole, 1,000 years before medieval history started. Really, the Anglo-Saxons ruled this country from 450 A.D. to 1066, which is a long period, and they are a fascinating people. They began as immigrants, as pagan immigrants. They turned themselves into warrior kings. They became Christian. They became one of the first sort of united countries post-Roman Empire around Europe, and had some great kings and really settled society in a way that we would recognize today. And of course, they left a legacy of English language. So I've always found them interesting. And when I decided to write historical fiction based on the Anglo-Saxons, I thought I would be writing about those warrior chiefs and all they've done. But then when I started studying them, and maybe this is because I've got three daughters, but I found that they were all quite interesting, but fighting battles and bashing shields with your sword and doing those all, and then getting drunk afterwards is all very interesting for a while. But then you begin to wonder about what's the wider society like and what goes on behind the scenes. And that's really where the women came in. Anglo-Saxon women had a reasonable amount of power. They could own land in their own names. They could be head of households.
Oh, wow.
They were never normally part of the warrior class, i.e. they didn't get involved in the fighting and the sort of politics at that level, but they became abbesses, they ruled churches, they did quite a lot of things that probably later medieval women couldn't do because the feudal system took away their rights. And so I discovered that there are one or two really interesting Anglo-Saxon women, and one in particular that has really interested me for a long time. And I finally got around to researching her life and writing about it. And she was called Æthelflæd, and she was, as the title of the book says, King Alfred's daughter, and she was his eldest child. So she was born, and as an eldest daughter, she was quite a prized possession in the politics of the day. Women were widely used as what they call peace maidens to go out and create an alliance with a neighboring kingdom or somebody that you needed to have on your side. And King Alfred was very much up against it. As the people of Winchester will know, King Alfred was the last kingdom to stand against the Viking invaders back in the 10th century and 9th century, and he began to create a small alliance. He had the kingdom of Wessex at his disposal, but he also had half of Mercia was still left unconquered by the Vikings. And he had a great ally there called Æthelred. And Æthelred, to keep his loyalty and to sort of cement that alliance, he sent Æthelred his very young daughter at the age of probably about 16 to marry. So she made the journey from Winchester into Mercia, which at that time, half of it had been invaded by the Vikings. So it wasn't a desperately safe place or a desperately good place to be. And Æthelred himself had created a small enclave around Gloucester, which is where his people came from. And that's where Æthelflæd, at the age of 16, arrived.
I can really see why you're so interested in this part of history. It sort of teeter-totters in this really lovely space between recorded history and legend almost, and that's obviously such fertile ground for storytelling. I can't wait to ask you even more questions about all this, but before we do, we're going to take a quick break here on Winchester Today Arts Plus. David Stokes and I will be back before you know it. Welcome back to Winchester Today Arts Plus. I'm Connor Gormley, and if you're only just joining us this week, I'm speaking to novelist David Stokes, whose latest book, King Alfred's Daughter, tells the story of Æthelflæd and her rise to power in Mercia following her father's death. She's a real warrior queen, and obviously, David, a book like this takes a lot of research and a lot of diligence and a lot of hard work, and I wonder how you set about bringing this sort of thing to life.
Well, yeah, researching a historical book is an interesting field. What I do, and I think what some other authors do, is you obviously immerse yourself in the period. So you find out all you can about the Anglo-Saxons, and you read the general picture of the Anglo-Saxon period, and then you find a character that you're really interested in. So you want to write about them. So I found out about Æthelflæd. And when I started researching her, I discovered the most interesting thing about her, which I wanted to major on, was the fact she'd actually been written out of history by her brother. Her brother Edward became king on the death of King Alfred. And they did work together, the two of them, to try and regain the Viking territory that had been taken from the kingdoms of the Anglo-Saxons. But Edward was very concerned himself that the kingdom of Wessex still had the upper hand over the kingdom of Mercia, where Æthelflæd worked, and so he made sure that she wasn't really mentioned in the historical records of the time. When I dived into the original sources, the main one of this period are called the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles. Now they written by monks. The main chronicle was probably started by Alfred himself in Winchester, so it was written really under the control of the kings of Wessex. And those monks would write down the main events of the year, which they would then send off to other monasteries around the country. And the local monks were meant to just copy it out, and that would be a sort of historical record that would be common around the country. However, and luckily for us, the local monks, particularly those in Mercia, in Worcester, for example, where probably some of this documents arrived from Winchester, the local monks realized that actually the monks of Winchester had not taken any account of what Æthelflæd was doing in Mercia. So they made insertions into this sort of standardized history of the Anglo-Saxons, more localized facts about Æthelflæd. And that's how we found out that she really did have a huge impact, not just in a social way, but actually because her husband, Æthelred, became ill, she really had to take over running the kingdom, running the state of Mercia. And so she really took over control when he became ill.
Historical fiction is a really interesting one, especially when you're retelling someone's story like you are. I wonder, where does the fiction start and the fact end for you? You know, where do you find that balance and draw that line?
Well, this varies enormously between different writers of historical fiction. Some writers interpret historical fiction very loosely and just have a general picture of the particular period, and they insert all sorts of new characters, all sorts of new events, and they even make very strange things happen to well-known historical characters that we know definitely didn't probably happen. That's at one extreme. At the other extreme, I think I sit probably closer to the other extreme, whereby I like to write only the key events of the book are the key known historical happenings of that time. So I don't make up battles that didn't happen. I don't make up too many people that weren't in the historical record. And the key principal actors of my book actually lived. Having said that, we don't know that much about the Anglo-Saxons, so you obviously have to make up quite a lot of things. We have to interpret their character within the context of what they did. Yeah, you have to put your own interpretation on it. Now, for my part, I took the story of Æthelflæd as is known, and there's probably, you could write what is actually written in the original historical documents on a single sheet of paper, what is known about her life. But there are some pretty key significant events, like she defended the town of Chester against Viking invaders. She retook the town of Tamworth, which was in the Danelaw. So we know these facts. How she did it and who her lieutenants were, because although she clearly had a military strategy and she was the leader of that military strategy, she wouldn't have fought herself on the battlefield. She would have led from somewhere near the battlefield, but not actually in the battle. So she clearly had some lieutenants who did that for her. We don't know their names, so I had to make up 4 or 5 people. We know about her immediate family, but so you have to interpret what actually took place in a way you think is fitting to their character.
So is there a sense for you then that the historical fiction you're writing is maybe a little bit less about telling a story in a given world you find interesting and more about breathing life into what actually happened, into sort of abstract ideas and events and characters that might otherwise seem a bit distant?
I think that's a good summary of how I've approached it. Yeah, I wanted to breathe life into a person that has been, well, she's had ups and downs in terms of her visibility to people like ourselves. She sort of disappeared pretty much after her immediate life, as I said, because she was written out of history for political reasons. She was then rediscovered by the Victorians, who made her into some sort of warrior goddess. And then again, she sort of dipped and disappeared. And just lately, she has reappeared. And there are certain towns like Tamworth that have really got behind celebrating her anniversaries and her life. So really, having rediscovered her in that way, I wanted to put her in touch with people's imagination, really. I mean, you can read about someone just in bare historical facts, but unless you have them speaking words and imagine them doing things, it's more difficult to realize what they're really like and that they did truly live. And
definitely, I think that's part of the power of fiction, isn't it? A history textbook can tell you what Napoleon did, but only a novel can make you feel what it might have been like to stand in his shoes or alongside him as he drew up these legendary battle plans. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there, but this has been a wonderful chat, David, and I'm so grateful for your time. For those of you listening at home, King Alfred's Daughter is due out on March 28th from all good bookshops, and you can find out more about David and about his work via his website, www.davidstokesauthor.com. That's Stokes, Stokes, by the way. But yeah, either way, I'm Connor Gormley, signing off for Winchester Today Arts Plus. As always, I'll be back with more next week.